On this episode, we're going to be talking about strategies on how to position yourself to be a guest on other people's podcasts, collaborate with other podcasters, co-host with podcasters, and the incredible opportunities that it will bring for you in 2024. Stay tuned. This is the Podcast in the Rough. Tune in every Friday for new adventurous episodes. Welcome back to the Podcast in the Rough. This is episode 134. I'm your host, Zebulon Thomas, and I'm excited about this episode because it's really going to help you leverage your podcast to another level. And for many of you just starting out and you're still thinking about podcasting, this is also a great way to dive into podcasting before you get started, believe it or not. And so I'm going to be sharing with you strategies for collaboration and networking that can next level your podcast in 2024. First of all, I just want to say that the sun is shining in my window here in Studio B, and it looks amazing. It's early morning. I love this energy right here, and I share that because I hope that many of you that are building your podcast, that you get this experience right here. This is what it's all about. It's about creating something that is all you and delivering value to your community and your listeners and getting to experience moments like this where it's like, you know what, you're on the right path, you're doing the right thing, you're just having fun with it. And that's the important part of podcasting that I share with everybody. So I just wanted to say that to motivate you to get started in your podcast before I dive into this incredible script that I've put together for this episode. Have you ever considered being a feature on a podcast as a guest? Have you ever thought about that? Now, I said this just a little bit ago about how this could be something that you start with if you haven't started your podcast. Yes, you can start here. You can start here by sitting in on other people's podcasts, watching how it works. The flow, how they present themselves, how someone hosts it, how they deal with guests, how does the guest react to the host. All of that is information that you can learn by experiencing it firsthand. And I'm a big fan of immersing yourself in the environment that you need to be able to thrive. So that's one thing that I want to share with you is that you can start here. And so apply these strategies where needed. So if you have considered being a guest on other people's podcasts, doing so will create synergistic content and expand your listener base. In this segment of today's episode, I want to create a quick, effective roadmap for being booked as a guest on other podcasts. First off, when should you start seeking collaborations? The answer is yesterday. Seriously, the earlier the better. The podcast community thrives on connections, so start building those bridges right from the get-go. And some of the things I've done early on when I started my podcast was precisely that. I went out and said, I have some things to talk about, but I don't feel comfortable enough to be able to continuously produce just information. And I didn't want to sound boring. Even though I compiled a bunch of information and I would share that on my episodes, I still actively seeked out other people doing podcasts. And I found a way to sit in on those lessons, learn about them. And then I had the opportunity to have some fun and actually be a guest before I even had a podcast. Now, we focused on my ZT Films and my commercial career. And it was nice to be able to be the guest and be able to share some valuable information. And it was fun to get asked questions that normally people don't ask me because I'm so busy in the field creating content for other companies that now the spotlight was on me. And I was able to share those insights and experiences and the things I've learned, earned, and developed over the years. With that being said, I started to build a small network of podcasters and I met their guests. And so I had plenty of other people that I could interview and bring onto my podcast. Now, how do you know when you're ready to be a guest on a podcast? It's not just about the number of episodes under your belt. It's about having a clear, conscious message. When I was a guest on those shows, I had a clear, conscious message because I was pulling from my career as a videographer, as an entrepreneur. And so I had plenty of things to share, but I also fine-tuned my message so that it would be received in a way that really served me and the show that I was a podcast guest on. When you create this conscious message for yourself, you need to be able to articulate what makes your podcast unique and why listeners should tune in. So if you have a podcast and this is your focal point, like for me, it was ZT Films in my film career, now it would be about my podcast. And I know exactly what that message is. I would get on an episode with someone as a guest. I'd find ways to tie into what we're talking about. And then I would say, listen, my conscious message is that I teach podcasting on my podcast. I teach people how to start and launch a podcast without spending any money or finding a budget and building out the ultimate podcast setup. And in short, I'm teaching people how to podcast from start to success. And that prompts the listeners to go, I want to tune in and see what this is all about. So once you got that down and you have a clear message, you're ready to start spreading your wings and share your expertise. And don't feel like you're not worthy enough, because you are. The things that you can share are very unique to you. Listen, even if you've studied so much about what you do, once you've learned that, now you can convert that into your own tools and strategies and share that to others trying to get to where you're at. Crafting the perfect pitch is crucial. Knowing your audience, understanding the host style, and tailor your message to align with the content. What topics can you dive into that resonates with their audience? I always talk about an experience, and it's so important to create the experience, not just on your show, but when you're a guest on someone else's show, they're creating an experience and you are to add to that experience. So this is really where you and your personality and your message being clear opens that up and really makes a lasting impact. Now, when you're finally a guest on another podcast, how do you promote yourself or your own show without sounding like a broken record? Everybody wants to just throw up all the promo stuff and it's like me. How do you really cut through the clutter, sound professional, and nail it? And that's what I want to go over in this segment. Now, when it comes down to this, it's all about being creative and leaving an impact. I always say, don't tell your audience where to find you. Let them ask you. I believe that you have to earn this promotional plug. So if you do a good job and you add massive value or entertain during the podcast that you're a guest on, then the floor is yours. It's open. You've warmed up the audience. You've got them on the edge. They're ready. They want you to tell them where they need to go. Now, there are other ways to plug your podcast before you get into that home run. And you do this by mentioning your podcast when relevant. And you make sure that you're an engaging guest. Authenticity goes a long way in the podcast world. And even if you don't get to plug your promo and you don't get that home run, you now still have an experience that you can get better at and turn into social proofing content for yourself as you move forward and grow your podcast. Teaming up with other podcasters can take your content to the next level. Consider collaborative events, joint episodes, or even co-host opportunities. Diversity in voices and perspectives not only bring freshness to your content, but it also widens your reach. And to give you an example of that, co-hosting to me is exciting and it's a huge opportunity, because the difference from being a co-host to a guest is, as a co-host, you're in the position of practicing helping that guest feel comfortable, pulling the best information out of that guest to share with the listeners. And so you're really adding massive value to everyone in this. And being a co-host, you're taking a lot of the stress off of the main host, and you're learning, and you don't have the spotlight 100% on you, so you're not under that pressure. So you get to really have fun and get loose. This is the sweet spot. So I encourage you, if you're doing podcasts or you're just starting out, go find other podcasters and volunteer to be a co-host on their show. And if you want to dive a little deeper into this, we'll talk about this in the podcast community mastermind group, in which I'll show you how to get access to if you're not already a member. This way we can go over strategies on how to get booked as a co-host and what to offer, how to build your co-hosting press kit. But what if you don't have a PR person to help you get booked? Well, that's okay, because you can do your own PR work. And this is how you do that. You reach out to podcast hosts directly, you attend networking events, and you leverage social media to showcase your podcasting skills, or even just your podcast. If you make enough noise and you add enough value and you put some eyes on you, like, look over here, this is where the party's at, people are going to come. People are going to ask you to be a guest on their show. They want to know how to get involved in your show. So this is a two-way street here. It's amazing. And really it's an opportunity. And all you have to do is make an effort. Just make an effort. Put yourself out there. It doesn't even have to be perfect. You just have to showcase what you do and what you're about. And that's where your personality comes in, or your skill set, or what you talk about, or the topic of service that you're providing. That is all exciting. And I find this to be 99% more effective than having a PR person do it for you, because this really eliminates all of the walls and builds a solid connection when you're shooting from the hip, so to speak. So when you get out there and you get excited and you go to these events and you're firsthand going, hey, I have a podcast. I'd love to talk to you about it. I'd love to see how I can co-host you, or if there's an opportunity for us to collaborate. And that usually opens the door for them to say, yes, we'd love to collaborate. Actually, we would like to have you as a guest, because that'll give us content and give us something creative to talk about. Nobody can sell you better than yourself. All right, I want to take a moment right now to encourage many of you that are inside the podcast community mastermind group to get active and start to launch your podcast. Many of you have not started your podcast yet, and you've been in the group for a while. And I just want to openly encourage you and motivate you that all of us in this community support you, and we're ready for you to take that step. It's okay to take your time, but don't delay. It's very important to take action, even if it's little baby steps. And maybe that's just researching the mic and ordering the mic. When you order it and take action, it's real. When it shows up, now you have something to do. And for those of you who have not yet joined the Podcast Community Mastermind group, there is a hungry community inside this group that is waiting for you to engage and support you. So if you want to get access to this exciting community and learn how to podcast from start to success, simply just go to thepodcastintherough.com/learn and get involved. It's absolutely free. Get in right now. It's exciting. All right, we are approaching the end of 2023. What a year. And I want to say thank you to everybody who has supported this podcast over the years, and especially those who have supported this podcast in 2023 doing the reboot of season 3. And that means a lot to me because it was the encouragement of my listeners and the support that I found when I returned to my podcast episode after taking a break from social media altogether. And it was a nice, warm welcoming, and it was really exciting to get back into it. And that led me into fine-tuning and crafting one heck of a season 3. And it also helped me create a new name for my podcast, The Podcast in the Rough. And I couldn't be more happy about it. And it also helped me, for the first time in 3 years, launch the official website for the podcast. And now many of you know that I've been producing premium content, and that premium content is going to get more and more in 2024. And I want you to have access to it. And by accessing this premium content, you get the opportunity to support this podcast on a whole nother level. And it's as easy as buying me a coffee. So head over to buymeacoffee.com/intherough and take a look at all the premium content we have, all the opportunities, all the things that I offer inside this crowdfunding platform for you to be able to get involved and show your support to the podcast on a monetary level. And your commitment and contributions is going to help this podcast grow, reach more people, and really create next level content inside this podcast. So I deeply appreciate your support. And if you can't contribute financially to the podcast, simply just leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or on the website at thepodcastintherough.com will truly help us grow much, much faster. So I appreciate that. And that is, to me, by far the foundational contribution of support, and I love it. So one more time, that website is buymeacoffee.com/intherough. Link is in the description below this episode. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Podcast on the Rough. I hope this encouraged you to think about becoming a co-host or a guest on a podcast. Be sure to tune in next week for another great episode of the Podcast on the Rough. We're approaching the new year, and I want to bring 2024 in a whole new way, and I'm excited about it, and I hope you guys are too. So don't miss next week's episode. Stay tuned. Take care. This is the Podcast in the Rough.